Greetings, friends. Juan Angrisky here, and this is the Russian-Ukrainian War update for the week of March 25th through April 7th of 2024. Now, that's not necessarily 1 week; it's 2 weeks because I was very, very busy last week with work. But I am now slightly less busy, and I could put things in. I could do an update for the last what happened in these last 2 weeks, and boy, did we get a lot of good updates this week. And this week, we're actually going to start in Bakhmut. Now, this is where a lot of people are. Well, one thing we could start saying is that the battle for Chasov Yar has started. You might be wondering, really? What's going on there? What happened? Well, in the last 2 weeks, basically, the Russians have cleared out on the northern front of Bakhmut almost everything that separates them between the first defenses of Chasov Yar, which begins here. This is an extension of Chasov Yar, and then also Bakhmut. So this entire northern sector has been, anything that was standing in the way between the Russians and Chasov Yar has been cleared, and now the battle for Chasov Yar has begun, for the most part. So, so let's go over those events. So first of all, as when we left off last time at the end of towards the end of March, we kind of saw the Russians kind of were focused on they were kind of along this kind of tree line right here and kind of on the northern outskirts of Bogdanovka. That's because the Ukrainians have multiple trench systems, here, here, just anywhere. You can't see it on the map here, but they had a lot of these right here, and they had multiple of these trench networks that the Russians had to methodically root out. What makes it harder is that it's an increased elevation. So every time the Russians advance, they would always be advancing on the uphill battle, which is always harder to do. So this is why it took a long time. But somehow, slowly but surely, the Russians were managed to break through here and managed to actually this week managed to actually land. There's a video of them landing here, and they took the first few houses in this what they call I forgot what they called this place, but this is kind of like a I forgot the exact name that the Russians call this area, but this kind of so one thing that separates this is the Seversky Donetsk Donbass Canal. Let me show you it right here. Right here. You could kind of see it on the map here, but this is where the Russians want to reach because this is a natural defense choke point. And it actually separates the center and most of Chasov Yar from kind of this extension of Chasov Yar right here. So the Russians are actually trying to take this kind of section of Chasov Yar. They've entered the first few buildings right in the center, and now there's rumors that the Russians are now trying to battle over these first high-rise buildings right here, trying to get themselves a little bit of a foothold. And they've been bombing this place heavily. They've been using the tactics they learned in Bakhmut and in Avdiivka, and and they've been basically razing this place to the ground and suppressing Ukrainian units. So the Russians have entered this area and have set up a little bit of a foothold, and this happened almost a week ago, a few days ago, and there's been constant counterattacks, obviously. But the Russians have not been pushed out. So we'll see how the Russians expand this bridgehead in the coming weeks. One thing that kind of facilitated this is kind of the capture of Ivanivska. I think we talked about this last week, or in my last update video, where they finally captured Ivanivska. And this has been confirmed in the last 2 weeks because we've seen Ukrainians using drones to attack Russian positions here. So, and according to Rybar, depending on who you ask, this source just says that they've captured the city, but outside of not the city, the town, the village. They've captured the town of Ivanivska, but they haven't actually done anything more. But some pro-Russian sources have said that they've actually expanded their kind of zone of control and actually are now controlling some parts of these forests right here. And so, what they're trying to do. One thing that a lot of people have kind of agreed on is that this northern part, which actually facilitated the fall of Ivanivska, was the capture of these. You can kind of actually see it on the map here. You could see the kind of the trenches that they've been trying to build here. But kind of basically this area right here was kind of captured by the Russians, and this was the local high ground. And the capture of this kind of high ground facilitated the fall of Ivanivska. Not only did this high ground get captured, this kind of led to again, as I mentioned it's kind of like a tree hopping strategy where the capture of one area allows them to locally control one area because then they're the ones on the high ground position. So kind of the capture of this kind of high ground allowed the Russians to take the last kind of Ukrainian defenses outside of Chasiv Yar here, which was facilitated, and then basically they've captured very quickly, and they captured this tree. This was another small defense line that the Ukrainians had, and then during the assault to enter the Chasiv Yar, they actually started entering this forest, and a lot of rumors are now that the Russians are now trying to gain a foothold in this residential area right here. This is part of Chasiv Yar. The reason why they're trying to enter this kind of like residential area is because it's a lot easier to get a foothold here, and they have this kind of railroad track as kind of like a natural northern defense line. But not only is it easy to capture, and they have a natural defense line in the north, this allows them to kind of attack this kind of place from two sides. And so basically, because of the success in this kind of middle direction, the Russians managed to finally collapse Bogdanovka. And so right now, the rumors are the Russians have captured about 90% of Bogdanovka, and basically the only thing that kind of is left of Bogdanovka is this area right here, this kind of farm area right here. So, but the village itself is under almost complete Russian control. Again, because that so the Ukrainians were, kind of on, they were in this position, right? But when they saw that the Russians were coming up from here after they managed to capture those trenches in the front of Chasiv Yar, they're like, oh, we are going to get flanked, and now it's time to fall back. And that's how the Russians kind of like to do their war strategy, is try to take the sides and then force the Ukrainians back. So now so basically the news came in, just today actually, of the fall of most of Bogdanovka. So the battle for Bogdanovka is almost over. The Russians still need to clear this kind of hill right here, and they still need to clear this kind of farm area right here. And so kind of I think the Russians are going to, in the next few week or so, try to basically make the front line be kind of like this, kind of get right in front of the village of Kalinova right here. So Bogdanovka, a lot of progress in the northern part. They've captured Ivanivska, and not only are they advancing, and basically now the Russians are also advancing along these forests here. Now, as I mentioned, most sources say they've captured this. Some sources, like Rybar, for example, say they've also made progress in the southern part right here. They've kind of been right here almost, taking a little, and they're slowly but surely trying to reach the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal right here. And so that's kind of the goal of the Russians, is to reach the canal. And once they reach the canal, what happens next? So, and I'm going to kind of talk about this right now. So I kind of talked about like what the Russians have gained in the last week or two, but like what are they actually trying to do? So they're going to try to do, I kind of talked about this early in the video, but try to put the pressure on Chasiv Yar. Once this forward base gets captured, they're not going to just continue advancing, or maybe they will. To be fair, this is just a bunch of residential areas. So, but again, the thing is that they need to secure their flanks before they continue moving forward, or else their flanks would be exposed. So what I will see for probably the rest of April is a battle for this, main section right here. And the Russians will try to advance towards Kalinova and kind of have the front line be, again along the Seversky Donetsk Canal. What I also envision is that once they kind of take this high-rise place in Kalinova, and kind of once the front line is along the Seversky Donetsk Canal, there's probably going to be two lines of attack. I don't think, it could be possible that they start advancing into Chasiv Yar, maybe having some sort of like bridgehead in this residential area. But again, the center of Chasiv Yar is again some more high-rise buildings here. And it's going to be very hard to take this area. So I envision maybe a small bridgehead here, where the Ukrainians will be held up in the center, and this will be kind of like a back and forth between two sides. But the Russians are not going to advance right into the center. They're going to try to slowly constrict it. And so to do that, I think they're going to start using the Seversky Donetsk Canal to continue flattening the front line. One of the main things that will help is that once they clear these forests to the west of Ivanivska, they can start moving down. And what this does is, because they'll be on even height with the Ukrainians, and thus when they go down this kind of Seversky Donetsk Canal, they could use this as a natural defense line, and also basically collapse the Ukrainian resistance in Klishchiivka and Andriivka. This has been a thorn in the Russian side. They realize they cannot retake these by direct assault. The Ukrainians are very much in strong positions here. So it's very much a the Russians probably are hoping to basically get behind them and slowly move down and force the Ukrainians to give up these positions and retreat back to the other side. So one thing I envision is something of them moving down here to flatten the front line, and then kind of moving the front line up here. If they want to squeeze Chasiv Yar from the north, it's not just enough to take Kalinova. I'm thinking they're probably also going to try to take Grigorivka right here. So, have the front line kind of be, maybe something like, again, along this canal, which provides a very natural defense line. And then, the Russians could try to make some sort of new defense line, at least ideally, which I don't think they'll do this, but something maybe along this kind of like ravine right here, and then right here. Kind of take these three villages and kind of, have, continue defending themselves from the north here as they continue put the squeezing on Chasiv Yar, taking this kind of, what is this, like some sort of forest area? Try to gain this area right here, squeeze it from the north, and then from here, try to kind of squeeze it from the south. Enter Stupochki here. Try to kind of squeeze it from the south. This is a big operation, so I don't know how much if that, because again, the Russians have always kind of been to this point where, they always try to encircle a city, but they never quite are able to do it. So I don't think they're going to try to encircle it fully. I think they're going to try to put the squeeze on it. Something like, maybe they're not going to like meet up, in this the middle point from the north and south. I think for Chasiv Yar, they're gonna put enough. They're gonna be on the north and south and in the front of it, but they're not gonna fully encircle it. They're gonna put this under fire control, and then just slowly, maybe move up from here. Move down from here, and then obviously move forward right here, and then kind of put fire control on these, areas right here, and just kind of force the Ukrainians out. Once Chasiv Yar falls, Chasiv Yar is the highest point in this entire area. The next Ukrainian defense line of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka is on the low ground. So the Russians will have a commanding height in this entire area. So that's where I think Chasiv Yar is going to go. There's a lot of interesting things happening in Chasiv Yar. I'm envisioning for the rest of April probably just Russian efforts to reach the canal, and then in May, that's when we're going to start seeing the battle for them to start trying to take Chasiv Yar. So we'll see. So lots of things happening in Chasiv Yar, kind of maybe in secondary import, kind of like maybe in support of this, is that the Russians have continuously activated on the Seversk front. This is a very quiet front, but the Russians, I think, are pushing here so that the Ukrainians aren't sending troops from here to Chasiv Yar. What do I mean by that? So first, we still see that the Russians are trying to put a lot of bombings near Rozdelivka. We saw the Russians pummeling this place recently in the last 2 weeks. We saw the Russians start advancing north of Visola. Visola is in the low ground, and they are trying to take these hills right here. These are hills which have lots of trenches in them. And if they capture this basically secures their position in Visola. Not only that, this will threaten Ukrainian troops in Rozdelivka right here. And I kind of think that this is where the Russians want to basically take this village so that they could kind of maybe have a new kind of defense line right here, so that they could have a more forward position as they advance towards the southern part of Seversk, and also pushes the Ukrainians more away from the main artery that supplies the Bakhmut front, or at least one of the main arteries that connects the Seversk front with the Bakhmut front. So the Russians are slowly advancing up this rail line, very slowly but surely, and they're now trying to advance along these hills right here. And they're bombing Rozdelivka. One of the most interesting things as well is that on this side of the Seversk front is that the Russians are now trying to, I guess, encircle this quarry. The Ukrainians use this kind of quarry right here, this white thing right here, as the high ground here. It gives them a dominating position along this area. And basically, this allows them to continue controlling Bilogorivka. And also that there's hills behind Bilogorivka, like right here as well. So The fact that the Ukrainians have control of these two high-rise places allows the Ukrainians to continuously have this position that is a thorn in the Russian side. So, the Russians have actually been focusing on this area right here. So, in the last 2 weeks, the Russians have basically advanced right. They kind of advanced from the positions here and are now right. Are entering. They took a few. It's kind of hard to kind of show on this map here, but they basically ran right in front of the quarry right here. They managed to actually start going towards the back of it right here, you could see. And they also advanced from their positions in this factory more towards in front of here. So they're trying to put the squeeze on this, and I think there's going to be some assault here to try to take this quarry by storm. And if they manage to take this quarry by storm, then that'll be a good way for then the Russians will have the heights here, and that they could at least force the Ukrainians to retreat back to their more defensible positions in Grigorivka here, instead of being able to stay in Bilogorivka. So maybe they might not even want to take Bilogorivka. Maybe the whole purpose of these Seversk front battles is to pin the Ukrainian troops here so they can't just send troops over to Chasiv Yar. There's been no changes in the Kupiansk and Liman front. The Russians are still trying to reach Terny, but we have still not seen any progress in terms of them actually being able to enter it yet. So we'll see if the Russians could continue their try to reach Terny. So let's get to the next part, where there's actually the most interesting part of the. So Chasiv Yar was exciting. This is also almost as exciting in the Avdiivka front. And basically this week there's been a lot of changes here. Now the reason why the Russians slowed down here is because the Ukrainians activated their strategic reserves after Avdiivka fell. And basically this allowed them to slow down the Russians, but now they don't have troops in case the Russians break through in another area. And so far the Russians haven't quite broke through anywhere, so it's been good for them. But again, they made a big gamble. But despite slowing down the Russians are now back on the offensive and are now taking back what they are now taking back land. Let's kind of talk to the northern part here. So let's talk about Berdichi. Berdichi is where the Ukrainians really don't want the Russians to have a good foothold, because a good foothold in Berdichi, like right here, would basically allow the Russians a foothold to start advancing towards the second line of Ukrainian defenses here. And I talked about this in the last video, where the next Ukrainian defense line is from Orchechny to the Vachashka River here. So they really don't want Berdichi to fall. However, the Berdichi has been about 50% captured by the Russians, maybe 60%. Yeah, about 60%. And so the front line, so there's a river that kind of divides Berdichi in half, that goes kind of like this. Not really even a river. It's kind of like a little waterway, maybe a river, you could call it that. But anyway, this river kind of divides Berdichi in almost in half, but anything on the eastern side of this river has been fully captured by the Russians. The Russians kind of entered this area, but they had a really hard time trying to advance northward and capture kind of the Berdichi that lies here. But the Russians managed to capture this in the last 2 weeks, and now they also, a lot of sources say they are now operating, like they have a foothold on this side right here. But there's certain parts of Berdichi that are still under Ukrainian control. This kind of area right here is under Ukrainian control. These tree lines that kind of form is still under, in this part right here is under Ukrainian control. Berdichi has not completely fallen, but slowly but surely the Ukrainians are losing the ability to continue contesting the village, and they are falling back and ceding ground in Berdichi. But they have fallen back to the other end of the river for sure, and this entire area on the eastern side of that is under Russian control. In Sinonovka, this is the last area. This was the last village that was under complete Ukrainian control. However, at least last week or two, has changed that. The Russians, after securing Orlivka, have actually managed to made a bit of a bridgehead here. So they have captured about a third of Sinonovka, and they are slowly advancing along the one street. Again, when it comes to these, these villages are small. This is a one-road village, and the Russians are slowly just moving up this. But it takes, again, since they're on one side of a reservoir, the Ukrainians could move along these roads and try to attack the Russians, and so the Russians have to be on the defensive from attacks on this end while also advancing along this area, and also they have to advance. And I think they're trying to use this bridgehead here to kind of advance from the north here. So we'll see how far Semenovka could hold on, but the Russians are now contesting this village and have controlled about a third of it from the south. But the Ukrainians are resisting fiercely. So everything on the eastern side of this river is under Russian control. So now the Russians have made two bridgeheads, one in southern part of Berdishi and one in the southern part of Sinonovka, and basically they're now trying to clean up Sinonovka and then the rest of Berdishi. And I expect these villages to fall within this month as well. So progress there, but one of the most interesting progresses has been in the southern part of the Avdiivka front, and let's talk about it. So let's talk about Toninka and Peremyska. So we talked about the capture of Toninka in the last 2 weeks, about how they managed to clear the Ukrainians from here. One thing that I found very interesting was that the Russians actually utilized a massive mechanized attack here, and because of these attacks along these forests. Now it's very risky. I talked about this in a lot of my videos, but it's anytime you do a mechanized attack out in the open along the fields, this is almost guaranteed for you to get knocked out by drones. And so that's what happened. A lot of Russian mechanized forces got destroyed, but they managed to take a lot of this area right here. We saw the Russians basically reaching, right at the edge of Umanska right here. They've captured, all these tree lines, a lot of these forests, and it's a lot of solid progress, putting a lot of distance between Toninka and Umanska and Yosnobrodnovka. The Ukrainians are trying to resist on this kind of ravine right here. Because if this ravine falls, this basically opens up the northern part of Natalova right here, which is where the Ukrainians fell back to. So they're trying to hold this area as much as possible, but there's a lot of resistance. There's a lot of intensity getting heated here, and so the Russians have made a lot of progress to the west of Tonika, taking a lot of these fields, and it's hard to determine exactly where the Russians are here. But sources say basically that the Ukrainians are still in control of Umanska, and they are still in control of Yasna Bronovka fully. But the Russians are right at the doorstep here. And so, I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians manage to enter these villages, enter battles for them soon. And one thing to also talk about here is the complete capture of Vodana. So Vodana is here. Now, the Russians have controlled this part of Vodana for over a year or so. And what happened is that actually Vodana, when you talk about the city limits of it, is kind of like this. It's this long and elongated village. And Vodana itself is was not fully captured until this week. We saw Russian flags flying at the very edge of this area right here. There was Russian flags being flown here. And so basically and the Russian Ministry of Defense basically reported that the full capture of this village right here. And basically the full capture of this village has led to the collapse of Peremyska. Now, one thing we talked about in the last before last time I came out, is that the Russians were in Peremyska, but the center of Peremyska was under Ukrainian control, and I'm like, they were going to need to enter it from the north here. But it looks like because of constant Russian pressure, almost all of Peremyska has fallen under Russian control. This is very, very significant in terms of pushing the Ukrainians away from Donbass. From Donetsk. But again, they need to, so they basically took the center of Peremyska, because again, the Ukrainians saw that, hey, we're about to be cut off. If we stay in the center of Peremyska, the Russians could advance here, cut off our lines of retreat, and then we'll be cut off here. And so they retreated to the village in Natalova. So lots of progress here. The Russians have basically managed to fully capture Vodana along this these reservoirs, and actually managed to force the Ukrainians away from Peremyska. And so most of Peremyska, 80% of Peremyska is under Russian control. And again, I'm going to talk about Chasiv Yar. So kind of the same thing with Chasiv Yar. What do I think the Russians are going to do? I think the Russians are still going to push here, but I think they are going to put a pause. But there's still some objectives that need to be met. But I think they're going to put a pause after this. And this is where I think the front line is going to go. I think the Russians are going to continue advancing until they reach the Vochachka River here, and basically use the Vochachka River as a new um, kind of defense line here. And these fields are going to be kind of no man's land. Let me kind of change the color here too to like black. And the Russians are going to, or the Ukrainians are going to have their defense line here. You can see that here. And so there's going to be this kind of no man's land right here. And the Russians will have their new front line here. And so this means they're going to need to continue advancing along these fields to the south of Umanska and to take it. They need to basically fully secure Berezhivka and Sinivka and have kind of a bridgehead on the other side of the river. And they also need to take Yazabronovka just because they need that as a forward operating base. And basically the capture of Umanska and Yazabronovka will lead to the collapse of Natalova. I think Natalova is going to be a lot harder to take. A lot of people think like, well, it took them a while to take Peremyska. Here's another village that is equally has as much stuff as Peremyska. Why isn't it going to take like forever to take this as well? Well, the reason I took forever to take Peremyska is because the Ukrainians were in control. To keep as a reminder, the Ukrainians had a front line that kind of looked like this, and so they the Russians could not take the center of Peremyska very easily. But now after the collapse of this is that again, so now the Ukrainians retreated to Talova, and the reason why they're able to hold that is because, well, they have, they're able to have constant communications to the north, to the south. But if the Russians manage to say, take Umanska and then, advance to Yazabronovka, and the Russians are right here, well then, not only will they have to contend from the front, they'll have to contending from the north here. And so I think that will lead to the collapse of Natalova very quickly. It'll be a battle for sure, but Natalova will fall, and the Ukrainians will retreat back to more defensible positions, in Karlovka and things like that. But I think, again, the whole purpose of this was to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk, and the Russians, if they manage to make the front line go right here, in terms of the northern Donetsk area, will have done their job, because then, the artillery is never on like the exact front lines. The front line for the Ukrainians might, will basically be, let's change this to like to black or something. Might be going around like this, but again, artillery is usually a few kilometers behind the main front line. So maybe they'll have the artillery might only be here or here or here, and that gives the artillery the ability to shell the Russian front line. They'll still be able to shell the Russians in the front, obviously, but they won't be able to just shell Donetsk itself because they'll be so far away, at least on the northern sector. Again, though, this kind of leads us to kind of the south Donetsk direction here. There's been a lot of progress here as well, and not as much progress, but still progress nonetheless. And but again, the whole purpose was to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk, and the biggest thorn on the Russian side now is Krasnogorivka. Basically, the Ukrainians still have the old 2014 defense line in Krasnogorivka, and basically are allowed to have artillery that's like right here, and they're able to shell Donetsk still because they're still within range. And so the Russians need to capture Krasnogorivka. One thing that's interesting is that the Russians have been trying to battle for this kind of southern edge of Krasnogorivka for a while, but there's been back and forths, and Ukrainians have managed to not let the Russians consolidate in this kind of sector right here. The Russians were trying to hoping to kind of have the front line be along this kind of rail line, and there's still clashes for it, but they have not been able to secure themselves at the south here. One thing that's interesting, though, is that the battle for Grigorivka is getting pretty interesting. We saw some videos of or was it reports of the Russians basically entering the center part of Grigorivka, but that was last week, and now Grigorivka is kind of like in this zone of a gray zone. Did the Russians retreat? Did the Russians fully capture this? We don't know. So Grigorivka, again, needs to fall, because then the Russians need to use that to use these reservoirs to kind of start encircling Krasnogorivka. And again, they can't continue advancing towards Karakova because, again, the Ukrainians have these, this long, they have all these fields in the open, and so if the Russians expose themselves too much, they could be attacked on the flanks here. But Grigorievka is just close enough that they capture it as a forward and they need to capture it in order to start encircling Krasnogorivka from the north. And again, the capture of once the Russians take Natalova, they'll probably try to link up with the forces that captured Novolska and try to basically encircle the Ukrainians that are in these fields right here. The Ukrainians will fall back towards this line here, and then the front line will kind of go like this. Once that happens, the Russians could basically start maybe an operation to kind of start advancing through these fields and start trying to encircle Krasnogorivka from the north, while the Russians try to encircle Krasnogorivka from the south from Grigorievka. So again, trying to put the squeeze on Krasnogorivka. So we don't, we got news that the Russians basically entered the center by occupying these schools, but we'll see if they're still there. But after we got reports that the Russians are in the center, we have stopped getting any reports. So we'll see how that. We'll see how we'll report next week to see what happened. Yeah. And then in Novomikhailivka, this is actually very interesting. So the Russians have basically managed to completely clear these farms to the north of Novomikhailivka, and not only that, they are now clearing the Novomikhailivka dachas right here. Most sources say, only confirmed sources say they've conquered half of it, but most sources say they basically are conquered all of it right here, everything on top of this fishing pond. And basically the only part of Novomikhailivka that's left is this western part. Which I think will fall pretty fast. The Russians not only are in control of the fields to the south of it, they also have now fully captured the center part of Novomikhailivka and are now advancing towards the western part. So the center has been completely cleared, and they have are starting to capture the parts in the on the western part of Novomikhailivka. Because of that, because they've been able to fully capture the northern part of Novomikhailivka, the farms and things like that, the dachas. One thing that's interesting about this place is that, so the Battle of Novomikhailivka is coming to an end. 70% of it is under Russian control. One thing that's interesting here is that if you look at actually like drone footages, is that a lot of people think, why can't the Russians just bum rush this area? This is just a bunch of villages. What's going on? Well, the thing is, when you look down, this is a heavily trenched up network. The Ukrainians actually have multiple trenches all along here, everywhere here. I'm writing everywhere here, but like it's everywhere, and it's actually a very fortified area. Sometimes people look at the map and think, why isn't there a lot of movements? But that's because everything's fortified. It's just you can't see it on the map usually. So, one thing what I think about what the Russians are going to do here is that the Russians are going to try to basically encircle. I think one of the main things the Russians are going to do for their summer offensive is to take Ugledar. There's been a lot of increased fightings, bombings in Ugledar, and I think that the Russians are going to actually try to take this. There's been a lot of bombings of the mines here, and I think the Russians are going to do two attacks. They're going to try to attack here towards Konstantinovka and take this small town, and then also try to do another attack towards Ugledar. We'll see how that works. We'll see if they actually manage to do so. They failed last time, but who knows. And I think what they want to do is have the front line be kind of along Konstantinovka and Ugledar. Not only do they have a road here that gives good supply, this area gives them good. Ugledar will give them the height advantage. These mines in the middle here are a national defense sector. And then Konstantinovka is a small town that allows them to kind of anchor themselves towards Donetsk here. And so basically the Ukrainians have a bunch, there's a lot of trenches, there's a lot of things here that basically prevent the Russians from just continuously advancing. And again, attacking along the fields is always suicide. So this place is mined, this place is trenched up to hell, so it's very hard for the Russians to advance. But again, the Russians, I think, have a limited goal of trying to basically, they kind of learned from when they tried to bum rush Ugledar before, and that the reason why they failed is because the Ukrainians made massive attacks from their mines. They had the support to do that because they had control of these villages here. So, again, it's a lot of work here, but we'll see. Yeah. So then we have So I think that's where it's going to go here. But again, they need to first take Novomykhailivka before they could start pressing on Konstantinovka and putting pressure on the supply toward Ugledar. Nothing big happening here. In Zaporozhye, the Russians are still trying to pin Ukrainian forces here. The Russians are in the center of Robotina. The Ukrainians are in the northern part. They're starting to continuously exchanging. They're trying to push each other out. The Russians have basically fully pushed the Ukrainians away from Verbova and are now just kind of fighting in the fields. They keep taking like one tree line, one little trench network, and things like that, trying to slowly push the Ukrainians away from Verbova. And yeah, so basically the Russians have lost. The Ukrainians have lost kind of the initiative in Zaporozhye, and basically are losing what they gained in the 2023 offensive. But again, very small gains, one tree line every week or so, and nothing changed in Kherson. In terms of that, we also saw the restarting of Russian attacks on energy facilities in Ukraine. Um, again, there's been a lot of them are actually targeting the actual energy production facilities. This is big because, before the Russians would only target the substations and things like that. But this, like the electrical substations, but this is actually the actual power generation, and that's not. They're knocking a lot of those things out. They're not, and all over Ukraine. They're also targeting gas networks, and not just power plants. So a lot of they're actually starting to target Ukrainian energy facilities, and this is in response to the Ukrainians starting to try to knock out Russian positions in like Russian oil refineries here and such. So. Yeah, so that's a big thing, and yeah, so we'll see how the Russian offensive goes. There's been rumors of a summer offensive. The Russian winter push is, I think, now just being localized because of the rain and mud. But once May comes, once June comes, I think we'll see some sort of big Russian offensive. Who knows? And who knows where that go? So that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Like this video if you like this video. Yeah, obviously, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Share this video around. Comment your thoughts. And subscribe to my channel if you want to see videos similar to this one. So aim high and wander on.